It was supposed to be just another raid. Quick. Controlled. By the book. But within seconds, a flash grenade lit up a quiet home and a single bullet changed everything. In the middle of the night, a 7-year-old girl named Aiyana Stanley-Jones was killed, while she slept on her grandmother's couch. The police said it was an accident. But to this day, no one has been held fully responsible. What really happened that night in Detroit? And how could one mistake leave a scar no courtroom could ever heal? Aiyana Stanley-Jones was only 7 years old. She had big brown eyes and a smile that could light up a room. She was a black child, growing up in a city where being young, poor, and black too often meant being overlooked. But in her family's eyes, she was precious. She loved cartoons, pink clothes, and playing with her little cousins. Her favorite color was purple, and she liked to braid her doll's hair. To her family, Aiyana was full of life. To the world, she would soon become a symbol one no child should ever have to become. It was Sunday night, May 16, 2010 in Detroit, Michigan. The house was small but full of love. Inside lived Aiyana, her father Charles, her grandmother Myrtilla Jones, and other family members. The home was part of a duplex, a two-family house with another apartment upstairs. Outside, the city was quiet. The street was dimly lit. Some street lights flickered, and a few cars passed slowly. It wasn't a perfect neighborhood. Many houses nearby were abandoned. Some had broken windows. Others were marked with graffiti. But for the Jones family, this place was home. Detroit had seen hard times, lost jobs, rising crime, and long years of tension between police and the black community. People had learned to live with fear. Not just of crime, but of how the system saw them. And more importantly, how it didn't. But inside that night, there was no fear. The family was settling down. Dinner was over. The TV was still on, but the volume was low. Aiyana had fallen asleep on the living room couch, under a thin blanket. Her grandmother sat nearby, tired but awake. She liked to stay close to her granddaughter at night. The house was warm. A ceiling fan spun slowly above them. The smell of cooking still hung in the air. It was a peaceful moment, the kind that comes just before sleep. No one in the house knew that their world was about to change. Outside, a police team was gathering. But inside, everything felt normal. Quiet. Safe. Charles, Aiyana's father, had stepped outside earlier. He wanted some air. Maybe a cigarette. He had no idea that officers were watching the house. He didn't know that cameras were rolling, that a raid was being filmed for reality TV. Back inside, Myrtilla looked over at her granddaughter. Aiyana's chest moved gently with each breath. Her small hand rested on a stuffed animal. It was the image of peace, of innocence. For Myrtilla, that night wasn't special. It wasn't anyone's birthday. No big plans. Just a regular night in Detroit. But later, when people asked her to remember it, she would recall the quiet. The calm. The way Aiyana looked in sleep, safe, still, unaware of what was coming. In that moment, everything was still right. The family was whole. The world outside was someone else's problem. They had no warning. No chance to prepare. Just a quiet night in a city where being black too often meant being unsafe even in your own home. And in the calm before the storm, Aiyana slept. It was just past midnight when the van pulled up. The street was still. No one walking. No voices. Only the quiet hum of the city at rest. But inside the van, a team of heavily armed police officers was preparing to move. They were part of a special unit trained for danger, focused, fast. This was supposed to be routine. In and out. They believed a suspect in a recent murder was inside the building. Upstairs. Not in the Jones family apartment. But no one made that clear. What most people didn't know that night was that the police weren't alone. A television crew was with them filming every step of the operation. They were working on a reality show called The First 48, a program that follows homicide detectives in the first 2 days after a murder. The show wanted to give viewers a real look at how cases are solved. Fast decisions. High pressure. The rush of the chase. For the producers, Detroit offered what they called good footage. A city with high crime, struggling neighborhoods, and busy detectives. They believed the camera could bring the public closer to the truth. But the presence of cameras also changed things. Some officers knew they were being watched. Some may have felt the pressure to act boldly, to show results. The goal was to make good TV, but real lives were involved. That night, the crew was filming the SWAT team as they prepared to raid a home. They were looking for a suspect in a recent killing. The upstairs apartment, not the one where Aiyana slept, was their target. But the building had 2 doors. 2 addresses. One wrong move. And the cameras caught it all. Outside the house, the officers lined up. One of them threw a flash grenade through the front window of the Jones apartment. It exploded with light and sound, a blinding, deafening burst meant to confuse. Inside, it caused panic. The sleeping family woke in shock. Smoke filled the room. Glass shattered. And within seconds, an officer rushed through the door. In the chaos, something went terribly wrong. Aiyana was still on the couch, where she had been sleeping. Her grandmother Myrtilla screamed. She later said the officer had already fired before fully entering the room. The police said it was an accident, that a struggle caused the weapon to go off. But the truth of that moment is still debated. What is certain, Aiyana was shot. A child. A mistake that could not be undone. The room that had been peaceful seconds earlier was now filled with smoke, noise, and confusion. Myrtilla cried out. Charles ran to see what had happened. There was shouting. Flashlights. Uniforms. Fear. The officers were not expecting this. They were looking for danger, not a child. But the damage was done. Aiyana, just 7 years old, was no longer moving. The officers carried her outside. Someone called for help. But the house had already gone silent. Time had slowed. For the Jones family, those seconds stretched into something much longer, something they would relive again and again. Inside, Myrtilla dropped to her knees. Her hands shook. Her heart raced. She kept repeating her granddaughter's name, as if saying it could undo what had happened. Her son Charles stood frozen, unable to speak. His little girl, the light of his life, had been taken in an instant. He wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but all he could do was stand there, watching the smoke still swirl in the air. The other children in the house began to cry. Some hid. Some stared in silence. No one understood what had just happened, only that something terrible had taken their world away. Outside, neighbors came out of their homes. Some had seen the lights. Others had heard the explosion. Word began to spread, the police had raided the wrong place. A child had been shot. And somewhere behind the lens, the tape kept rolling. But now, there was no scene to stage. No story to shape. Only a tragedy that couldn't be edited. The officers tried to continue the operation. Upstairs, they arrested the man they were looking for. But by then, nothing else mattered. A child had died. A family had been shattered. And the trust between the police and the community had taken another deep, painful cut. This wasn't just about one mistake. It was about all the warnings ignored. All the times fear was allowed to lead. All the times being black meant being treated like a threat even when you were only 7 years old. The house was now a crime scene. But to the Jones family, it was still their home. And in the middle of the living room, where there had been laughter just hours before, there was only silence. The sun rose over Detroit that morning, but the light brought no peace. Word had already spread. A 7-year-old girl had been killed during a police raid. Her name was Aiyana Stanley-Jones. She was black. She was sleeping. And now she was gone. The news hit hard. On the radio. On TV. In whispered conversations on porches and street corners. People asked the same question: how could this happen? Outside the Jones home, yellow tape wrapped around the porch. Officers came and went, silent, guarded. Reporters stood across the street, holding microphones, searching for answers. But the truth was already heavy in the air. Something had gone terribly wrong. Inside the house, the Jones family was in shock. Charles sat on the edge of his bed, holding Aiyana's favorite blanket. He hadn't spoken in hours. His mind kept replaying the moment, trying to change the ending. Just 1 second earlier. Just one clearer warning. Just one right decision. But the past does not listen to wishes. Myrtilla lay on the couch, the same one where Aiyana had been hours before. She kept her eyes closed, afraid to open them and see the world without her granddaughter in it. Her voice had gone hoarse from crying, but she kept whispering prayers. Not just for Aiyana but for justice. The rest of the family gathered in silence. Some held hands. Some paced. The house was no longer a home, it was a wound that would never fully heal. By noon, national news outlets had picked up the story. Headlines called it a tragic accident. Officials promised an investigation. The police chief gave a short press conference. He called it a difficult situation. He asked for patience. But outside, there was no patience. Community members came to the house, placing candles and flowers on the sidewalk. Children from the neighborhood stood quietly. They had played with Aiyana. Now they stared at her picture taped to a tree. Activists and ministers arrived. Some carried signs. Others brought food. Everyone brought questions. Why was a flash grenade used in a home with children? Why did the officers enter so quickly, without checking who was inside? Why was a TV crew allowed to follow a real police raid? Why wasn't there a safer way? And underneath it all, would this have happened if the child hadn't been black? Detroit had seen pain before. It had lived through riots, through poverty, through years of broken promises. But this felt different. This was not just about crime. This was about trust. And trust, once broken, does not return easily. The city was split. Some defended the police. They said it was an accident. A tragedy, yes, but not a crime. Others demanded charges. They said enough was enough. That if officers are trained to protect, then mistakes like this should never happen. And still, the cameras kept rolling. Clips from the reality show surfaced. Images of the officers preparing to move. The flash of lights. The sound of the grenade. People watched, horrified. It felt like a movie. But it wasn't. The producers of the first 48 said they were only there to observe. But many wondered, did the presence of cameras change the way officers acted? Was this raid meant for safety or for television? The Jones family didn't care about the show. They cared about Aiyana. They wanted justice not just in court, but in truth. They wanted someone to admit what happened. To say it out loud, we made a mistake. And it cost a child her life. But no one said that. Weeks passed. Then months. An officer was charged with involuntary manslaughter. But trials take time. Truth takes even longer. And for the family, every day without Aiyana was another day of quiet pain. Her room stayed the same. Her drawings still on the fridge. Her voice still echoing in memory. Her mother couldn't bring herself to move her toys. Her father barely left the house. Her grandmother couldn't sleep. Each night, the same question returned. Why? And in all of Detroit, no one had an answer. Almost 2 years passed before the first trial began. The man facing charges was Officer Joseph Weekly, the one who had entered the home that night. He was part of the elite unit, trained to handle danger, to make quick decisions. But now, he sat in a courtroom, no longer holding a weapon, only a suit and a lawyer. The charge was involuntary manslaughter. The prosecution said he had acted recklessly. The defense said it was a tragedy but not a crime. It was, they claimed, just a terrible accident. The courtroom was tense. On one side sat the family of Aiyana. Her father Charles, her grandmother Myrtilla, and other relatives. Their faces were tired. Their eyes heavy. But they showed up, every day, holding on to the hope that this time, someone would be held responsible. On the other side sat the police. Not just Officer Weekly but others too. Officers in uniform came to support him. They said he was a good man. A careful officer. They said he was only doing his job. Outside the courthouse, the city watched. Protesters stood with signs that read, "Justice for Aiyana." Others said, "Protect our children, not just your own." The trial was supposed to be about facts. About law. About what could be proven. But for many, it was about something deeper. It was about race. About power. About who gets believed and who does not. Myrtilla was called to testify. She took the stand slowly, her hands shaking. She told the court what she remembered. The explosion. The shouting. The fear. The shot. But during her testimony, something happened. The defense attorney began asking sharp questions. He pushed her, questioned her memory, her words. At one point, Myrtilla raised her voice. She was angry. Heartbroken. Human. The judge stopped the trial. He said her behavior was disruptive. For a moment, it felt like the courtroom forgot she was the grandmother of a child who had died. Like her grief had become inconvenient. She was removed from the courtroom. Outside, people were outraged. They asked, how could the person who lost her granddaughter be treated like a threat while the man who pulled the trigger was still being called professional? The trial continued, but something had shifted. Legal experts debated the meaning of reckless. They argued over training protocols, use of force, SWAT procedures. The jury listened. But the heart of the matter, Aiyana, a little girl, sleeping on her couch, was slowly getting buried beneath technical words and court rules. Then, the trial ended with no conclusion. The jury could not agree. A mistrial was declared. For the Jones family, it was another blow. Another reminder that justice is often delayed and sometimes denied. The prosecutors promised to try again. A second trial was scheduled. But as time passed, interest faded. Headlines grew smaller. Public attention shifted. Other stories filled the news. When the second trial finally began, things were quieter. Fewer reporters. Fewer supporters. The city had moved on, but the family had not. Once again, arguments were made. Once again, the same pain returned. And once again, the jury could not reach a decision. 2 trials. 2 chances. Still no answer. Eventually, the charges were dropped. Officer Weekly walked free. No jail time. No conviction. No apology. And for Aiyana's family, that was the end of the legal road. Charles sat on the steps of the courthouse, staring at nothing. She was 7, he said. She didn't get a second chance. Why does he? But the heart of the case remained with one man, Joseph Weekly, the officer who had pulled the trigger. He testified in his own defense. His voice was calm. His eyes downcast. He said he didn't see Aiyana. He said it all happened too fast. He said he didn't mean to fire. It was, he claimed, an accident. He described the raid as chaotic. He said someone bumped into him. He said he believed there was a threat inside the house. That's what they were trained to expect. That's how the briefing had gone. But many people watching weren't satisfied with his words. If it was a mistake, why didn't he say sorry? If he truly cared, why did he return to duty so soon after? Why, when asked on the stand if he had made any errors, did he reply, "No, I don't believe so"? That one sentence stayed with people. Because a child was gone. A family was shattered. And the man who had fired the shot stood there, still believing he had done everything right. For the Jones family, it was almost too much to bear. Charles shook his head in disbelief. He whispered to a reporter after the testimony. He didn't even say her name. Not once. Community members filled the courtroom gallery during those days. Ministers. Mothers. Activists. Some wept quietly. Others wrote in notebooks. All of them were waiting for the system to say that black lives, even small ones, mattered. But the system didn't speak clearly. The trials were over. The charges dropped. But the story was far from finished. For the Jones family, justice did not come in a courtroom. It came in quiet moments filled with pain, memory, and hope. Charles still carried Aiyana's favorite blanket everywhere he went. He spoke to reporters, to activists, to anyone who would listen. He wanted people to know who Aiyana really was, a bright, laughing little girl who loved to dance and sing. Myrtilla became a fierce voice in the community. She spoke out against police violence and called for change. She met with leaders. She joined marches. She prayed that no other family would face what hers had. In neighborhoods across Detroit, Aiyana's story became a symbol. A symbol of loss. A symbol of the struggle between police and black communities. A symbol of a system that too often failed to protect those who needed it most. The city held vigils. Candles burned into the night. People sang songs and told stories. They remembered Aiyana not as a headline, but as a child. Activists pushed for new rules. For police reform. For better training. For cameras on officers. For transparency. But change is slow. The wounds run deep. Trust is hard to rebuild. And across America, stories like Aiyana's repeat. Each one a reminder. Justice is not just about laws. It is about people. About recognizing pain. About listening when a community cries out. About holding those in power accountable. The story of Aiyana Stanley-Jones is not just one tragedy among many. It reflects a larger, ongoing struggle, one that has existed for decades. Across the United States, tensions between police and black communities run deep. These tensions are born from a long history of discrimination, fear, and misunderstanding. For many black Americans, encounters with the police can feel like a threat, not protection. Stories of violence, unfair treatment, and lost lives are shared again and again on the news, in conversations, and in protests. Detroit, like many cities, has seen this pain before. Neighborhoods where trust between law enforcement and residents has broken down. Where fear and frustration sometimes explode into anger. The death of Aiyana was one of many moments that sparked calls for change. It raised urgent questions. How do we rebuild trust? How do we ensure that every life is valued equally no matter the color of their skin? The answer is complicated. It requires more than new rules or better training. It requires listening. Understanding. A willingness to face uncomfortable truths about inequality and justice. Communities are still fighting for that change. For safety. For respect. For dignity. Aiyana's story reminds us that behind every headline is a human life, a child with dreams, a family shattered by loss, and a community demanding justice. Her death is a call to action, a reminder that the fight for equality and fairness in America is far from over. Thank you for watching this story on Rose and Crimes. If you want to learn more about true crime cases and the deeper stories behind them, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Rose and Crimes. Your support helps us keep telling important stories that matter. Together, we can raise awareness and keep the conversation going. Remember, every voice counts. Join us on this journey for truth and justice.